This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Thanks to all of you who have subscribed, shared, and been guests on this podcast over the past year. Today we conclude Season 1. And Season 2 will begin, God willing, in August with more discussion and commentary on relevant topics in the PCA, as well as episodes that highlight the wondrous things the Lord is doing in the Presbyterian Church in America. If you are able to support the work of this podcast financially, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. We end Season 1 with reflections on this month's 51st General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America with some very special guests. Today, I am joined by teaching elders Jacob Gerber, Ben Ratliff, and Steve Tipton. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us. Glad to be on.
Thanks for being on. Jacob, this is your first time on. Would you tell us where you are and how you're ministering now?
Yeah. I'm a teaching elder at Harvest Community Church in Omaha, Nebraska. So we're in Platte Valley Presbytery. I'm married and we have 5 kids and one on the way. So good to be here. Thanks, Ryan.
Wow. Congratulations. One on the way.
Yep. Soon, September.
All right. Oh, your poor wife pregnant all through well, it doesn't really get hot up there though, does it?
Well, not like other places, but it gets pretty warm, pretty cold.
Yes. But that's wonderful. And Steve, you're still in Florida, the free state thereof.
Yeah. So down in Panama City, Florida, where it gets really hot. So we're at 86 today. That's not bad. I guess the week before GA, it was like in the mid to high 90s most of that week. It was pretty brutal, but all things considered, a pleasant place to be.
Yes. Well, speaking of brutal jobs, you were the chairman of Overtures this year, which, from what I hear, was the shortest Overtures Committee meeting, most efficiently run Overtures Committee in perhaps the history of the Presbyterian Church in America. So tell us about this. Was this your first time to chair?
Yeah. So, I doubt it was the shortest Overtures ever, because
that may have been when T. David Gordon was chairing Overtures.
Well, or there were years where they didn't have like 25 or so. I think we had 29 Overtures to deal with, so that has a lot to do with it. But so it was my first time chairing Overtures. I've chaired a handful of other committees, but first time doing Overtures. So
great. So what did you do to prepare, or did you prepare any differently than you might to be moderator of Presbytery or something like that?
Well, get a good night's sleep. No, which is hard because it's like the first night in a new hotel with a new bed. I don't think I slept at all, actually, Sunday night because of that. But nothing special per se. I did want to make sure I was familiar with the specific rules that Overtures operates under. Although most of those are pretty standard rules for a committee. I guess the big difference would be you can move the previous question in Overtures, which you typically can't do in a committee, although it does take a 3/4 vote. And some of the other kind of minor differences between a regular meeting versus a committee meeting. I looked at a handful of kind of particular rules in Robert's rules that and conversed with some people who were pretty smart. I should have contacted Jacob, but I didn't do that. Just about some other things that have happened in the past. I've seen every year Overtures. I've been on the committee a handful of times, but even when I'm not on the committee, once my committee of commissioners work is done, like most people, I go back into the Overtures Committee and just kind of watch. And so no real preparation other than just the last 14 years or whatever it's been of being in Presbyterianism, being in meetings, and being able to run a number of them. Whether it's moderator of Presbytery, I was chair of RPR one year, and a couple of different committees of commissioners. So I think there's certain people who just really like that for whatever reason, and maybe do good jobs. And so I'm probably one of those who just really likes it, loves likes the rules and figuring out how things are supposed to work and trying to help brothers move through business. So
So moderator for life, Fred Greco did a fine job selecting you to be the convener, it sounds like.
Well, I did kind of bend his arm a little bit and say I would vote for him as moderator if he would agree to make me convener of Overtures. So
Wow, so this is part of
Collusion.
a
Quid pro
2-year
quo.
vast conspiracy.
no, just 1 year. It was
1 year.
in Overtures, and Steve Dowling did a great job as moderator. He was the chair of Overtures last year, and he did a good job as well. There were a couple of times where I think you got a little bogged down in Overtures, and Fred and I were talking about that, and that's where I think the hardest part about, and I'm sure Jacob can agree with this, like, and Jacob knows far more about Robert's rules than I want to know, much less ever will know. But like how difficult it can be to sit on the sidelines and watch somebody else, and like precisely what they should do to get the body out of this conundrum, but you're not the chair or the moderator, or you're not even, I mean, at that last year I wasn't even on the committee, so you're just sitting in the back watching this, this like train wreck in slow mo. It wasn't a train wreck, but you know what I mean, like this minor fender bender in slow motion, and you can see it coming, it's happening, and precisely what you need to do to get out of it, but you're like, all right. So that was kind of the impetus of it. Is again, I mean, I feel like I have some gifts and skills in those areas, and you like to use the gifts and skills that God has given you, and so I was very happy to do it. But and Fred was very gracious to make me convener, which of course doesn't mean that you're going to be the chair. It didn't hurt that our stated clerk in his clerk's briefing just kept referring to me as the chairman. I think that was very helpful in the overall system. But beyond that, yeah, it was.
I am hearing that there may have been a conspiracy. Then we might have to.
I can
Lots
neither
of grease
confirm nor
palms.
deny that there was a conspiracy. So.
Well, good, but well done, brother. Getting the work done so efficiently. What were some of your favorite moments in the committee? I didn't get to watch any of Overtures this year because you concluded so speedily. So, are there any favorite moments that stand out?
Well, I mean, a couple. So I think that my favorite part, this is going to sound weird, my favorite part was being able on some level to demonstrate to a lot of people in the PCA that I'm actually a somewhat, not an incredibly, but a somewhat funny person. I think most people who don't know me think of me as very serious and no nonsense, and maybe no nonsense, but like I had them not quite rolling in the aisles because I'm not that kind of funny guy, but I think there were people afterwards. I mean, there was a handful of people who even commented, something like, "Wow, I never knew you were funny," or something like that. So that was, and it was fun. I mean, I think as fun as Overtures or any kind of committee meeting can be. But that's sort of the joke side of it, I suppose. I mean, seriously, my favorite part of running a meeting like that, regardless of what it is that I see the role of a chair or of a moderator as helping brothers to do what they want to do, right? And so even if I disagreed with what somebody was trying to do, if what they were trying to do is allowable according to our rules, then I want to be able to help them to do that in such a way that they at least have the opportunity to present their motion or their amendment or whatever on the floor, but also to do it in such a way that we're able to move through those options and discussions with relative quickness. Anytime you have an amendment per se, I mean, unless it's one of those that's so obvious that you just ask for common consent and move on. But anytime you have an amendment that's going to, maybe even radically change something, there's going to be discussion and debate and so forth. And so really for me, it was less about, what I wanted Overtures to do on any particular issue, but rather helping that body find, to find their majority committee opinion on whatever matter was before us. And that's, that's what a moderator or a chairman is supposed to do. It was good to be able to do that and to help them. And I think as well, just to see, see brothers coalesce around opinions and decisions. And this year, I think, was a little different than in past years, especially, the years kind of following Revoice. A lot of the decisions, there's the cat again, a lot of the decisions or a lot of the overtures, rather, the recommendations, probably you could anticipate where people would stand on them based upon, whether they go to the GRN lunch on Wednesday or the evening gathering or whatever. I mean, those types of things, right? But this year, I think a lot of our discussions were less along, for lack of a better word, previous party lines, so to speak. And there was a lot more debate and discussion. I felt like that really people's minds were changed when there was issues they hadn't considered or hadn't thought about. And I think that was really good to see and just to be a part of, obviously not part of the discussion and the debate, but to be part of that from the perspective of helping the body get through those issues. So.
That's good to hear, that we're maybe less polarized and to deal with more practical matters of ministry. You mentioned something about unanimous consent, and Jacob can help us here. As I understand it, unicorns, lady pastors, and friendly amendments are all fictional creatures.
Yes.
But if there were, the way a friendly amendment could be accommodated is by unanimous consent. Is that right? So if someone wants to offer an amendment that was agreeable to the maker, the body could just ask for unanimous consent. Is that how that works?
Well, yeah. I mean, so there is no such thing as a unicorn or a friendly amendment. I mean, an amendment's an amendment. And there were a number of times where, as moderator, or sorry, as chairman, somebody made an amendment, and I felt like, just reading the room, no one's going to be opposed to this. And so I would just simply ask, is there any objection? And no one objected. And so that's sort of the common consent thing. But I think that's the chairman's prerogative, not the mover of the amendment or even the maker of the motion. Once a motion's made and seconded, it no longer belongs to you. Right. It belongs to the body. And so, and I did that a number of times. I mean, like 4 or 5 maybe. Yeah, I think that's in a sense, those are friendly in a way, in the idea that they're not trying to change it per se. I mean, obviously they're making a change, otherwise it wouldn't be an amendment, but it is something that is trying to improve. But, most amendments are trying to improve, maybe not in the direction the mover wanted, but there's a sense in which they're trying to do that. But I think only one person made reference to a friendly amendment, and I was able to say no such thing. It's just an amendment. So, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's when the chair states the motion that puts it before, and so you can't withdraw it or modify it without consent of the assembly. But in there, you've I don't know if I didn't get to watch any of the overtures either, Steve, but I know I've seen in previous assemblies and overtures that sometimes the chair, when it's moved and seconded, that the chair actually helps the maker. Maybe you're trying to say this, or you need to address that, or something like that, so the chair can actually work with the individual to get them to get it before stating it, and then it does belong. Then you can't do it anymore on the individual basis.
Well, and I think what I did, and Scott Edberg, who was kind of running the screen for us, was doing a really good job of this as well. Is somebody would make a motion like an amendment, and invariably somebody yells second, and I'm sort of like, none of us are really sure what that motion is yet. Just give me so we would always make sure it was up on the board, and I would always say, is this your amendment? And whoever the mover would say yes or no, and then I would ask for a second, because that's, that way, prior to putting it before the brothers with being moved and seconded, even if there was something like, I think I maybe only did this once, where it was sort of like, well, that's not like, that's not grammatically correct, or something along those lines. Try to give some minor things where to make sure that the mover says, yes, that's what I want it to be. But once that happens, then it goes to the brothers. And again, there were some times where it was easy enough to say, is there any objection, and kind of move it in that way. But my other favorite moment, sorry, I know we almost moved on from this one, but there was a voice vote, and I tried to do voice votes just because they're a lot easier than using the clickers. And it was absolutely perfectly clear to me that the ayes had it from the voice vote, and somebody asked for division, and we did division with the remote clickers, and the vote was like 66 to 64. And I'm like, I told you. I mean, I've got good ears. I told you that's what it was. And I think that was one of the first moments that people realized that I'm funny. So that's the big thing I get out of Overtures Committee is Steve Tipton is a lot funnier than you've ever thought he was. So.
Well, perhaps in the future you'll be in a prominent role again, and people can, maybe even more people can see just how funny you are. But there were a couple, as I understand it, there were a couple of motions to reconsider. Would you tell us how that works, and what that's a debatable motion, is it not, Mr. Parliamentarian, to reconsider?
If the motion was originally debatable, then
right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So how did that work?
Yeah. So we had two different ones, and hindsight is 20/20, and you walk away from any meeting and you realize the 15 things you could have done better or whatever. And the first motion to reconsider probably should have handled it slightly differently. There was a substitute motion on the floor, and I feel like, generally speaking, I did a really good job of describing what was about to happen. And so usually, I like to put things the way you're supposed to, like in terms of a question. I mean, the question before us is, shall the substitute become the main? And you say yes or no. And so when you do it that way, you're not voting yes to what the substitute necessarily says, because the substitute may be to answer in the negative. Right. The question is, shall the substitute become the main? And I've always felt like that's really clear and people understand what you're saying. Unfortunately, I think there was a man in the room who got confused because the substitute was in the negative, was to answer in the negative, and he voted the wrong way. And the vote on that was by one vote. Now, I'm still not convinced that if his vote had changed, I think it would have been a tie and it still would have failed. And so in one sense, it really didn't matter that he voted the wrong way, because it's still the end result would have been the same. Yeah. But he wanted a vote to reconsider because he felt like his vote was wrong. He didn't understand. And there's at least a potential, right? It's sort of like, in a class, when one person asks a question, there's a good chance that other people had the same question. They just didn't ask. So it's possible that other people voted the wrong way as well. But we, so in a committee, when there is no, you can always reconsider a motion. If there's no advance notice, then it requires a 2/3 vote. If there is advance notice, it's only a majority vote, unless you can guarantee that everybody who voted is in the room. And this didn't come out right away. And what I probably should have done is just had them at least vote to reconsider immediately, because it would have been obvious that everybody who just voted was in the room. I mean, at least potentially. I mean, I suppose somebody could, run for the door, but there wouldn't have been the issue of the notice or whatever. And so, but they gave notice, and then we did it. I think the next morning, Tuesday morning, was the first time that came up. But the issue with reconsider is, when you make a motion to reconsider, the debate can enter into the reasons why you want to reconsider. Like, I want to reconsider this motion because there was an option we didn't consider yesterday when we discussed this, and I think the brothers should hear it and we should have an opportunity to discuss it, et cetera. And that was not really what was going on. We wanted to reconsider because we thought somebody thought the votes were not accurate. And so that motion to reconsider didn't pass, even though it only needed a majority because there was advance notice, it didn't pass. And so that one was, again, I mean, I probably could have handled it slightly differently at the time, but I think the end result remained what the committee, the majority wants. And that's the essence of sort of Robert's rules, is it gives the minority an opportunity to speak and make motions, but at the end of the day, the majority gets to do what the majority wants to do, what they vote to do. So I think it all ended up fine. The other reconsideration, I believe, was, I actually think it was 33 that are there. I can't remember now. There was one of them that ended up being significantly changed, and it might have been 33, where there was like a third option that never really got discussed the day before, and somebody wanted to bring it up. And whatever it was, it might not have been 33, but whatever that was, in the discussion of I want to reconsider, there was enough of this is going to be significantly different than what we discussed the day before, that the brothers were willing to reconsider the motion, and it came back before us, and we were able to deal with that. And that's the good thing about a committee is, the design of a committee is, free, open debate that can theoretically last. I mean, other than the fact that we do have the special rule where we can move the previous question in overtures, which you can't usually do in a committee. The point is that, the body, the General Assembly has created overtures to have these long, drawn-out debates so that we don't have to have them on the floor. And so especially at this point, we ended before lunch. We had plenty of extra time that if we needed to go into long debates on things, we could do that. So I think both of them worked out well, even though obviously one of them failed and one of them succeeded. The motion to reconsider. They were just different.
Yeah.
My other cat.
Any questions before we move on to from Ben or Jacob?
What's your cat's name?
So this one is Prince Caspian, and the other one is Coco. So he's never called Prince Caspian. We usually just call him Casper, or Sea Boy, or Floofy Boy, or any number of 1,000 other things other than his actual name. So if I called him, well, he doesn't come when you call him anyway. He's a cat. But if he was a cat inclined to come when you called his name, he would not know that his name is actually Prince Caspian.
That's good. The other thing I would just say about overtures, I wasn't in the committee meeting, but Steve, on the floor, I thought you did a really good job. I told you this in person, but especially that's where you're kind of representing the committee, you get to speak a little bit and try to reflect the will of the committee. And you responded, I thought, really effectively to sometimes lengthy debates on some of the overtures that came before us. And I thought you really crystallized arguments, and you really responded to arguments that came up on the floor. And so I just thought that's probably the other part of the chairman's job that I thought you did really effectively. So that was really good work.
Thank you. Yeah, that was my least favorite part of it, in a certain way. So, for two reasons. So Monday night, I was at dinner with my pastor group that I'm a part of, and they kept asking me questions like, "What happened in overtures?" And I'm like, "I have no idea what we did today." Like, I was so focused on getting us through the business that I really wasn't paying a lot of attention to what we did. I had notes and stuff like that, but what did we do on this overture? I'm like, I don't know. And in fact, even giving the report when we went to lunch before the minority report issue, I thought the committee lost all votes, and we actually only lost one. It was the one on overture one. The other three passed, but I was like so focused on, I just, for some reason, I thought we lost all of them. But the other side of that too is like giving that report, and this is, I felt like sort of my job is sort of like like an attorney in one sense, right? That I'm representing my client, which is the committee, and it really doesn't matter what my personal opinion on any of these overtures are. I'm supposed to defend the committee's decision and try to do that in a convincing way.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, some of the overtures or some of the recommendations that came from Overtures Committee, I might have gone slightly different ways in some of them, but that was, my role was to do the best job I could defending what the committee did, and I tried to do that, and probably I don't think I did a very good job, but appreciate you saying that. But anyway, yeah. So that was a difficult part of it, especially the thinking on your feet and listening to other people's arguments, and I think in some of them, just trying to get us back to what the real issue is, as opposed to the issue that people wanted to make out of it. But anyway, yeah, those are I know you got some specifics you wanted to go through, and it's probably better for the specifics rather than the general. But yeah.
Well, let's move into one of those specifics then. So Overture 33, which dealt with a book written by a PCA missionary entitled Jesus Calling, it was heavily amended.
Yeah.
And so, REO 15.6 proposed amendments to overtures must be germane according to Robert's rules. So is it your role as the chair to determine, is this amendment actually germane to the overture, or who decides, who defines germane?
Well, I imagine Webster's does a pretty good job of defining germane. And actually Robert's rules does as well, although it's more of an art than a science, I think, germaneness. But given the fact that the overture dealt with concerns about a particular book and its relationship to the PCA, and wanted to have questions answered about that book, then the shift from what actually was an unconstitutional attempt to form a study committee, in the sense that, I mean, it could have been fixed, but it was out of order the way it was originally in the overture, because it didn't provide for funding, and that's necessary, and it cannot be. There's certain ways that funding cannot be done, so that could have been fixed, but that was not what the Overtures Committee wanted to do. But I do think that, and again, I mean, this goes back to even some of the debate on the floor, like this has something to do with a person, or even really a book per se. That's not really what the overture, as it was amended, was about. It was more about the relationship between some of the permanent committees and agencies of the PCA and their history with the book, and to a lesser degree with MTW, with the person, obviously the author, because she was married to an MTW missionary. And I don't think this is about, pulling Sarah Young out of wherever she's buried and burning her in effigy or hanging her or whatever else. But it is about the reality of what the denomination's relationship to a book that is troubling to a lot of people in the PCA. And the other thing, again, I mean, this is one of those arguments that as you walk off the stage, you realize you probably should have said, although the overture passed, so it wasn't necessary, but it was this idea that, when you write something, whether that's a blog or a book, you are not immune to criticism. And it doesn't matter if you're alive or dead, what you write is completely subject to the critical engagement of other people. You can't write a book and then get upset because people don't like it or critique it or whatever. I mean, that's just the nature. If you publish something, and even a podcast, right? You publish something, people have every right to engage critically with what you've done. Right. And we should have done this a long time ago. We didn't, but now we're going to, at least in a limited way.
Yeah, that's a great point. That I don't know that it was made at all. That people have criticized me for things that guests have said on this program, and I know that
just you wait till this one goes live.
I'll be getting the certified mail, I'm sure. Is that why you think, and based on what you just said, it was hard for you to follow the debate because you're trying to keep the debate, within the the boundary lines. But what was it that persuaded people of the necessity of Overture 1 or Overture 33, excuse me, as it was amended? Was it just that there were questions and
Yeah.
'cause I think
I think it was, in one sense, it is kind of that outstanding questions about the relationship with certain agencies. And I don't think there was anybody in the room at Overtures, unlike maybe on the floor of the assembly, there wasn't anybody in Overtures who were like, hey, this is a really good book, why are we going after this, or anything like that. I think some of the discussion, and we heard this even on the floor of the assembly, was, if we're going to go after this book, there are lots of other books we should be investigating or going after. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I don't know that we need, General Assembly level study committees to go after every single book.
yeah.
I was part, when I was in Ascension, Ascension established a study committee and to look into Greg Johnson's book, Time to
Still
Care.
Time to Care.
Still Time to Care, yeah. And so, we created a study committee report for our presbytery on it. And so, I think that there's plenty of opportunities to do that. It doesn't have to be at the assembly. Any presbytery that finds any book, concerning or whatever it is, it doesn't have to be a book, but they can establish a study committee. And in many ways, I think that's a better route to go about it anyway, because you have, I don't know, just the reality of presbyterial interaction versus an assembly of study committee. I don't like study committees typically, not General Assembly level study committees. Usually they end up asking questions about things that I feel that I'm competent to go look into myself if I wanted to. I think the one about the insider movement is probably the only one I've ever seen that I realized, okay, this is well outside of my wheelhouse. I'm glad we have a study committee to look into it. Now, I will say that most of the study committee reports we've had over the last 10 years have all been really good reports. It's just, did we need them? This is a different question. But I think, again, sorry, back to 33, it was, I think it was the limited nature of the questions that were being asked, the fact that they were specified up front, not just investigate and ask questions, but we want, answers to what ended up being 5 questions, although there was a lot of overlap, and from 2 particular committees that I imagine could answer them, without a lot of difficulty. Certainly we're going to have to go back into the records and look, but it's not going to be hard to answer those questions.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it was helpful to say, yeah, we need to do something about this, but not the full-blown, in-depth, dig into every last detail type of study committee,
Right.
But very specific questions. So
yeah, because this came from our house. It was, I gather from the questions Overtures placed before the assembly, it was briefly sold by our house, and so we want to know why, and then why was it withdrawn? Because this is, again, a book by a PCA author. Why would you withdraw a book by a PCA author? But the way the question was propounded to the assembly was to request, or whether or not to request, reports from these 2 committees.
Yeah.
So maybe, Jacob, you can, when the body requests something from one of its committees, does that have the force of just a question, or does the committee, which reports to the body, have to answer that question constitutionally, according to Roberts? And because I was intrigued by the verb request, not instruct to provide, but request.
Well, instructions that the assembly gives her committees are binding on those committees.
Right.
But I
This
guess
was a request.
I guess people do funny things sometimes, but
Yeah.
technically, they're binding on. I don't know what would happen if they just said we refuse, but the committees are supposed to follow the instructions of the assembly. Yeah.
Even if it's phrased as a request, because that's all we did. We just requested. And that was, I thought, one of the strengths of it is we're just asking. We're not saying you have to. So, but in your opinion, as a former registered parliamentarian, the request has the force of instruction?
Well, yes, it has it has the form of request. So I guess I won't pretend
Yeah.
to imagine what responses might come back from a request on that semantic
Yeah.
sense in terms of like demand. It's not a demand, but I
Right.
would expect that our committees would again, these are not
Yeah.
complicated things. I think that they're fairly factual. So I would fully expect that they will do that,
Wisdom
and
would
they should.
certainly,
Mhm.
yeah, wisdom would certainly come out. Well, this isn't a hard question to answer. This isn't going to take 50 man hours to research. Did that enter into debate, Dr. Tipton, about should we make this a request for a report or instruction to report? Um,
Yeah, I don't recall if there were a lot of amendments to the request.
wow.
If I remember correctly, Brad Isbell, who's a ruling elder in Tennessee Valley, is the one who brought the motion. And so to substitute this for the original, and I don't recall there being a lot of wordsmithing on it, but somebody else might, Brad certainly would remember better than I at that point. But and I think again, a lot of times, the language you use allows things to kind of go through. It's an easier pill to swallow, even if the effect is not much different than we're
Yeah.
requesting information from a committee. I think it would be, and again, like Jacob, I don't want to speculate on what they're going to do or say, but I mean, I would hope that they would take a request from the assembly as something they need to do. I mean, again, it's not quite the same relationship, but when my wife requests, I put the clothes away. I'm going to do that. I'm not just going to be like, well, you only requested, so
Right. Right.
But anyway, I think there's a good chance we'll get good answers back. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ben, you are active in the podcasting circuit and the blogosphere. What do you think the fact that this passed, and decisively so, it was by about 150 vote margin. So it wasn't like it was one of those that we passed or failed by 40 votes. This was a decisive vote. What does that indicate about the state of the PCA, that we are looking into something that, even from 20 years ago, yet on the floor I heard was theologically at odds with our standards? Does this indicate anything about the culture, the health, the state of the PCA right now?
I mean, it certainly speaks to the health of it that we're interested in finding the answers to some of these questions. The surprising thing to me about Jesus Calling was that it went so long without being brought up in the PCA. It was sort of like Inman kind of stumbled upon it, a couple of years ago maybe, and I think the rest of us are sort of around the same time. So the length of time that passed before we became more aware of it was a little alarming to me, but I do think once it became known in most circles in the PCA, the response was fairly quick. I mean, it didn't take long for us to get it in the media, right? I mean, I know Presbycast did an episode. You've done an episode. It came to the floor pretty quickly through this particular overture. I'm not too troubled as in terms of where this is going to head. I mean, we've seen a trajectory at GA the last several years with the assembly pressing our permanent committees and agencies for answers to questions and not allowing them to sort of withhold information. So I expect, I think Jacob just said it, these are pretty easy questions to answer. I'm encouraged, I think, that we'll get a good report back from our committees on these matters. And if we don't, I'd see every reason people would press even further.
Yeah.
So I think generally I see health in this whole matter from several perspectives. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think, we heard, maybe we even saw sort of the shift that had taken place where in years past there was at least an openness to even continuing gifts of some sort in the PCA. I know it's officially against our polity and our Constitution, but I think there's been an openness to it. I saw one email written by a brother who referred to that and thought that this book might have just been in that vein of continuing tongues or prophecies, whereas the assembly at this point in 2024, is that what year it is?
Nobody knows.
No,
what I'm told.
I lost track in 2020 for some reason. But the Assembly is closing that door hard and fast, and we just had a strong SJC decision published earlier this year on continuing gifts. So I think this speaks to the health of the PCA, that we're going to take a look at this and do so in a pastoral way, because as Steve, you pointed out, there's no one's digging up a grave, no one is discussing a person's Christian character. This is a book. This is something that was written and fair to discuss. All right. Well, I know we're coming up on about 45 minutes here, so I want to move on to the discussion around review of presbytery records. I know that's not quite where you were in the driver's seat, Steve. But what did y'all make of that lengthy discussion? I don't recall an RPR report that was that lengthy in terms of debate. Do y'all remember anything like that in your vast experience in the PCA?
Well, so a number of years ago, maybe 2004 to 6, somewhere in that range, there were a number of minority reports that were coming out of RPR, and by nature, they took a long time, right? I mean,
yes.
There's a set number of minutes that you're going to have those discussions and the back and forth. And so I don't think we were anything near that level.
Yeah.
I've never seen as many floor amendments as this year. And that was odd. And I was a little surprised. I was a little surprised by the result, because most of them had to do with the RPR committee finding the granting of certain exceptions to be troublesome. And I think we did I was on RPR committee. I think I did the General Assembly trifecta of, CCB, RPR, and Overtures this year. So, but at RPR, we were discussing a number of questions that some of the read teams had about various stated differences that were granted exceptions. And I mean, what the Assembly could not know is we kind of was like 50-50, where there were a number of them that one particular read team had some concerns. And when we heard the stated difference, the body was like, no, that's not troublesome. We're not going to make a big deal out of that. But the ones that ended up on the floor were bigger issues. And, in some places where, and again, I can't remember all the details, but a lot of them were in relation to images of Christ, and not in the sort of educational role, but in terms of I think one of them in particular, I recall this one, some sort of comment that images are an aid to better understanding Jesus, and that's a really, really dangerous statement to make, that an image is going to help us understand Jesus better than the word itself. And so there were some things like that. The problem was, and I kind of alluded to this when I spoke on the floor at the RPR portion, is that there's been this major push to shorten our report, because RPR reports sometimes can be 200-300 pages.
Yeah.
And we want a shorter report. I guess in the digital age, who cares? But especially when they were printing them on site, and you could tell when the RPR report was being delivered, because guys were holding these stacks of paper 6 feet high, trying to pass them out. Yeah, and each of them was that much. And so we foolishly thought brevity was the soul of wit, and just made the blanket statement that Presbytery granted an exception that appears to be out of accord, rather than give the details of why that was. The details were in the information that would go to the Presbytery, but they weren't on the floor.
Right.
And therefore it looked like we were just making blanket statements with no nothing to back it up. And so
Yeah.
the brothers on the floor didn't have an opportunity even to consider what it might have been.
And you know, I appreciated the guys. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I'm the secretary, or was the secretary. I'll be assistant secretary for this coming year, and Steve's gonna be the vice chair next year. But we're what he said was exactly right. It's. I mean, I have the report. We list exactly who it was, exactly what the issue was, exactly what the concern of RPR was. But that's not something that made it onto the floor of General Assembly for that report. We try to redact names and try to keep some of those details confidential. And so I thought about saying something along those lines. Steve said it well, so I didn't want to prolong that debate. And if they want to send it back to RPR, I was a little annoyed because I'm like, oh, we always have so much to deal with at those RPR meetings. They're brutal. So I didn't really want to go back and have to redo things again. But at the same time, if it kind of live and learn as we are trying to figure out exactly how much is enough and important to say and how much is we can cut down and whittle down. That's fine. We can add a little bit of an explanatory of like the specific issue for the GA, because I understand to some degree someone saying, hey, what are we even voting on if it just says there's an exception that RPR didn't like? What does that mean? That's fair criticism. We'll try to be better about that, I think, next year. But I don't like it going back to RPR because that just adds from this year more to do next year.
Yeah, well, that was my motion.
Like, every year, or not every year, like maybe every 2 to 3 years, somebody will go to a microphone during RPR and will complain about RPR even looking into the granting of stated difference or exceptions to stated differences. And I think the argument made by the individual who was moving it is, how can you cite us with an exception of substance for doing precisely what we're told to do? And the issue that is being missed is that, number one, you're told to judge something, and therefore it's a wisdom decision you're making, and you could make a poor wisdom decision. By that argument, somebody could grant an exception when someone has a stated difference that they don't think that the Holy Spirit is really a part of the Trinity or something like that. Well, we judged it, and we did what we were supposed to do, so who are you to tell us we made a bad decision? Right now, again, none of these exceptions were in the heresy area, right? But they did seem to strike more at, again, the vitals of our religion, our system of doctrine, and that's an amorphous thing. Not an amorphous thing, but it's an undefined reality. Right. What are the vitals? What is the system of doctrine? And so, you're going to get different people with different opinions. But I think overall, the discussion at RPR was good. I think we made, we might have erred a little bit too far in some of the exceptions that we cited. But at the end of the day, the presbytery just responds, and, we go from there. That's kind of the nature of how this whole thing works, is it's a dialogue between the assembly, not RPR, although it's through RPR, but it's a dialogue between the assembly and the presbytery about things that are concerning. They don't even have to be troubling, just concerning. And
one other point on that, there was a slight change within RPR from last year to this year. Someone in RPR brought up, and the committee brought up, and I thought it was a really good argument, that in the past we've said there may be a problem with this exception. We need more information to judge it well. And they pointed out that's actually not within the purview of RPR to ask questions. Either we say it seems to be an issue, and you can then respond and say, here's why we actually think this is an acceptable difference to grant, exception to grant, or to just accept it and move on. But there's not this middle route of like fact finding. We'd like to get more information. And so that's where some of those are stated in that. It might have sounded harsher if you're just reading that report without kind of understanding that context, but I thought that was a good point. So you might see more of these just straightforward statements coming out in the future. Yeah. But again, as Steve said, like all the presbytery has to do then is just to respond and say, here's a fuller explanation of this, or here's a clarification of those questions, and the matter can end there if it should end there, but that's all that's needed.
And I think
I
that's
left that floor debate. Sorry, Ryan.
Go ahead.
I walked away from that portion of the floor, pulling out those things out of the omnibus from RPR, wondering how well informed those men were about how it actually works. And I don't remember any of the guys that stood up and pulled out of the omnibus noting exceptions and asking for a response is one thing. I gather, y'all can inform me if I'm wrong, that having your name of your presbytery in the citation section is a much more significant issue, which is where you may want to debate on the floor if you want to remove a citation. But just to ask a presbytery respond, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Maybe there was a typo or a mistake. Maybe there is a conversation to be had, but to waste time pulling really, we could have ended by lunch on Thursday had that not happened.
Yeah. And especially with even the way some of those 40-5 votes went, we didn't need the debate.
Right.
For at least the one, it was like 1,000 to 40.
I remember you and I looked at each other during that report and were just baffled that they were pulling all those little things and not any more significant things.
Yeah. And maybe that's something that we can do a better job educating folks that, look, an exception of substance, a finding of an exception of substance is just essentially asking for more information. And in my presbytery, one of the things they did, it wasn't my idea. But they asked that we would rewrite our standing rules to redo the way we do review of session records. Because it used to be, everybody just gets together at lunch, reviews them, and signs off on them. But they wanted a permanent committee to do that. And so when we started doing that, we were finding all of these exceptions of substance. And we were getting into have to litigate them on the floor. But now, a couple of years later, the last time we had, I think we almost, we went into like letter M, letter M in terms of the numbers of exceptions of substance for our presbytery. And I think we only debated one on the floor. Because people have sort of learned, okay, this is just asking for information. You come up with an explanation, and the committee will probably recommend that this is an acceptable response. Right. And that's the end of the matter. So I wonder about an amendment to the RAO that prohibits amendments to findings of exceptions of substance. And I'm divided on that because I think it should be the bodies. We don't want to give too much power to a committee. But also, we don't want to spend an hour debating something where we don't have any of the record. All we have is just a few things.
Well, and RPR is weird because I think it's the only report that is entirely amendable on the floor.
Right.
Regular rules. So theoretically, with 88 presbyteries, we could be there for 6 days if enough people want to continue making motions to amend and strike and change. And so... Again, maybe, go back to you can refer or vote down, but you can't amend. I mean, something along those lines. I think that would be potentially helpful. But at the same time, I mean, it's one of those places in our business as an assembly where, kind of what we do really matters for a minute. I mean, not that what we do in the COC for PCA Foundation doesn't matter. It matters, but it matters in a different way than what RPR does. And so I think that's reflected in the nature of the discussions and what happens. So,
there's also a proposal that RPR is considering, and it got delayed to next year. That's considering a third kind of exception, or you might call it, where the idea would be to, on some of these ones that are maybe marginal, maybe need clarification,
just an inquiry.
Yeah, to inquire directly from the committee to the presbytery, and then if it's an issue, to then put it in. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. We didn't have time to talk about it much here in this year in RPR, except to just kind of introduce it. So that there are some thoughts on how to kind of proceed with some of these questions, but you still, even if you had that, you still might have some exceptions that are brought forward that people might want to remove or whatever.
Yeah. And that's something I've seen in my presbytery too, that when we first started this really rigorous review of minutes, that people were saying, well, why didn't you call the church and ask them about this? Well, I don't have, I have 3 people active on my committee, or maybe 6. And for us to divide up and try to call every church and try to sort out their minutes, it's easier just to have an official correspondence. And so that may be a way to do that, where they're corresponding directly with the 1 year, cycle, so that it's not zapping so much time.
But I think also, like, that's the whole point of having minutes. Like, part of this is like, we want to make sure our minutes are actually not needing further on the phone, hey, tell me what the rest of the details that I need to know about this. Like, and that's hard. And, even really experienced clerks make mistakes in certain ways that they know better. They just missed it. But that's the point, that someone's reviewing it and make sure all those details and boxes are checked.
Right.
Yes,
in writing.
Absolutely.
Well, the other thing I'll say too about, particularly when it comes to, judging stated differences, one of the things that I've seen, and I've been on RPR every year but one for the past 14 years. Wow. Clearly I did something wrong at some point in my life and I'm paying for it, but is that you see trajectories in certain presbyteries where they're definitely getting better year over year over year. And then they get a new clerk and it goes a different direction sometimes. But I think most presbyteries are doing a really good job of improving year over year. And RPR, I think, is helping in that. Maybe unwanted help, but it's helping them. But I also continue to see, men for transfer ordination who will come and their stated difference is going to be something like, I have the recreation clause, and that's the extent of their stated difference. And I think presbyteries, and this is some presbyteries, not all, really just need to do a better job of two things. Number one, of saying to men long before they come to the floor, if you have differences with our confession, it's incumbent upon you to clarify what your difference is, why you hold it, and to do more than just say the standard recreation clause or the standard images of Jesus thing. Or the worst, in my opinion, is I hold the continental view of the Sabbath, which...
What is that?
Yeah, is as a meaningless statement, but whatever. So in that sense, it is, I think, some presbyteries, maybe all to a certain degree, just need to get better at saying to candidates, whether ordination, transfer, whatever. And one of the ways that I've been able to do this in some of the presbyteries I've been in is to say to a guy, you do realize that this statement is going in our minutes and will be read by many other people, not just us, but it'll go to RPR. Is this really the statement you want people to be thinking, attaching to your name? That, and again, you don't need a 7-page document, but a 7-word sentence is not sufficient either. And to be able to say to a guy, and it's one thing too, like if you have a floor discussion and you ask him all these questions and you clarify, and now, okay, the men in that room are happy, but what you ought to do is say to that person, rewrite your stated difference, right?
Yeah.
If you don't believe what we thought you did when you wrote it, but you clarified orally, go back and change that and have them do that. No, don't just, say, well, we're all satisfied, let's just move on. The ordination, the licensure, the transfer of ministers is one of the most important things that presbyteries do.
Right.
And I think they take it seriously. But sometimes from the minutes, it can be hard to see that they actually, I know they do take it seriously, but when you read the minutes, sometimes you're like, I'm not sure you took this all that seriously, even though I'm sure they did. The minutes didn't reflect that. And so that's where oftentimes there's that discussion and debate. So
we only know what's in the minutes.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what do you think it indicates about the PCA that there's seems to be a relative frequency, at least recently, of judicial citations under 40-5?
Well, this is a hard one because there's sort of two different routes that a 40-5 report can come to the assembly. We'll take up the controversial one first that happened last year with Metro New York, which was something of not quite a unicorn because unicorns don't exist, but was something of a unique situation. It was a 4-leaf clover type of thing, where the RPR, and I wasn't on, that was the 1 year out of 15 or whatever that I wasn't at RPR. But they,
So this is your fault.
yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah. But they saw what was a very significant issue in the minutes of Metro New York, and felt like, well, and in one sense recommended ultimately to the Assembly that this was more than just an exception of substance that we go back and forth on. And so cited Metro New York under 40-5, and there's obviously a lot of debate. I mean, you can go find a lot of this still online, and there was a protest, and there was a response, and there was an SJC decision that included a lot of extra words that probably should not have been there, but whatever. About the propriety of that, I think the Assembly was very clear that they believed they had every right and authority to do what they did, and did what they did. And I don't think that should be taken off the table for RPR. It's happened one time that I'm aware of in 51 years where RPR sort of from nowhere came up with a 40-5 request and asked the Assembly to move in a different way. I will also say that practically speaking, if you read the SJC decision, that if the Assembly had decided, no, we're going to go the normal route or the regular route of exceptions of substance and back and forth, we would be at a very early stage of a long 5-year process of going back and forth with Metro New York. Their first response to the SJC rejected and said, no, you have to go back and do this again. I do think that there could be a change, a couple of changes in our REO regarding that, to where, maybe you say something like it takes a 2/3 majority of the Assembly if it comes from RPR. I wouldn't have a problem with that. It would have passed. I mean, it passed overwhelmingly last year. The other one that I think we need to do is that once a 40-5 citation is sent to the SJC, I know the SJC members are not going to like me saying this, but I think they have to deal with it until it's completed. I think sending them back to RPR this year was not a good idea. And so I think once it's given to the SJC, I think they should just deal with it until
there
they're
were some
satisfied.
SJC members who wanted to do that. Some of the either concurrences or even dissent maybe said as much, and one was about 4 lines. So,
yeah. But the other 40-5 issue, and this is another area where I think the importance of that section needs to be highlighted, is that we've had a number of them over the past 4 or 5 years. And in all of those other instances, they arose from members who, in one way or another, had really no other way of raising their concern. There was one out of Mississippi Valley where a woman was excommunicated and by nature had no recourse to any courts of the church. There were a number out of Northwest Georgia, which are complicated. Yeah, thank you. That's a good word. There was one out of Georgia Foothills a couple of years ago. There was the one out of Columbus Metro, but also there were a number this year that came up that the committee said,
this is incredible report.
That. Well, actually, that was kind of interesting. So we didn't say we didn't believe you. We just said that even if we do believe you, what you're alleging happened is not a grossly unconstitutional thing.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's a high bar. It's a 2-part bar, right? Number one, we have to believe the report that you're giving us. And then when we believe the report has to be about a grossly unconstitutional action or an important delinquency. And it's a 2-prong issue. And so I don't think we need to get rid of 40-5. I will say I don't like that they go through RPR. For instance, I provide some assistance to the state clerk's office in answering, polity questions. People who email the state clerk, I get some of those and answer them. And this week on Monday, the Monday after General Assembly, we received a 40-5 request. Well, guess what? That's not going to get looked at
May.
until May of next year. And so now this is a very difficult situation, and it's probably, I don't think that the RPR is going to find it to be a report of a grossly unconstitutional, but let's say we got one today. We
But
couldn't
if
do
it went to
anything
the
about it
SJC,
until next
they would
year.
take it up in October. Yeah.
Theoretically, yeah. So I think there's a process issue that needs to be addressed and fixed. But also, I don't want any SJC member to think that I want more work for them. But at the same time, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer. I just know that there are some problems with the way it's working, and maybe the slowness of it isn't a bad thing. I mean, Presbyterianism does move at glacial speed sometimes, and that's not always
by design.
What's that? Yeah. So, but I mean, if you have a presbytery or even a church that is badly dealing with the situation,
we need something.
And for whatever reason, the session isn't dealing with it, and maybe the presbytery doesn't understand or isn't involved, then a 40-5 sometimes can be the only way you can get the wheels of justice moving back in the right direction. And if it's going to take an entire year and maybe longer,
the ship has sailed.
Then
Yeah,
often.
I think Matt Fender made that point on the floor in one of the BCO 40-5 discussions, that this really is the only recourse. And even in past SJC's decisions, they've identified that, you know, the only way, I think they've, like, if I'm recalling some of the details of some of the ones, they've said this can't come up toward us in this way because, for example, the member doesn't have standing in presbytery. The member can't make a complaint against this or that. So the only way this, even like in a congregational meeting, I think that was the issue.
Yeah.
It came up in a congregational meeting. So it's not even something, it's an action of a session to complain against. And so they would say the only way this can come up is by review of a higher court, 40-5. And so again, I think one of the principles of our polity is we have to protect individual members, and I think that needs to be preserved. However, I do think we had a couple come through last time, and I was actually on the read team for Metro New York for last year, and one of the additional issues that led RPR to elevate the issue was that Metro New York had reviewed the situation, and like the investigation was all in the minutes, and they didn't do anything about it at that time, which was why it wasn't like, hey, why don't you take a look at this? It's that they already had, and so it really needed to go to a higher court to deal with that. But
because their initial response was, there's no strong presumption of guilt here. There's no basis for charges here.
Yeah, correct. So the next issue was then, okay, we need to actually not just ask them about it, because they've already asked themselves about it, but now to have that actually adjudicated in the Standing Judicial Commission. Yeah. But then when you have other issues that come up, we had, as Steve was saying, a number of issues that we really, now that a bunch of people started, oh, hey, look at that, 40-5 in the BCO.
It exists.
You brought a lot of stuff that really should have gone through, that should have actually gone by complaint. And it's not just it's not a fast track to the SJC if that's what you're looking for. So I think we, and the officers of RPR had a lot of questions, our conversations throughout the year where we were talking, is this a report of a grossly unconstitutional proceeding? Is this a credible report? How do we evaluate this? And so I think you'll see a lot more sifting if a lot of those are continue to come in the coming years.
Yeah. Well, and we also want to make it very clear to anyone who watches this podcast, to the entirety of the General Assembly, that the normal and the proper route is complaint and appeal. Right? And not only does that actually work a lot faster than you think a 40-5 will work, it's the proper way. And so if somebody were to raise a 40-5, and I've seen a few, where basically like they're in the middle of a trial. Well, no, you need to proceed with the trial and then appeal, or, well, if you still have an opportunity to complain, you need to complain. And 40-5 is not there so that when you realize that the time limit for complaint has passed, like there's a reason we have a time limit for complaints. you don't get, I mean, it's not there as sort of the safety net to just catch people who didn't
60
understand
days.
how
It's a
our rules
long
work.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
anyway.
as we wrap up, Jacob, what do you think this particular assembly says about the health, the trajectory, the state of the PCA right now?
Well, I had two thoughts on that. I do think last time, which there was a lot of review and control, and this time, as we kind of dealt with some of those issues again, and dealt with another host of issues, I'm just really encouraged. I think the highest court we have, the General Assembly, is I think taking really seriously, and the commissioners who are coming, and the speeches you're hearing, people are taking really seriously what we're doing and the health of the denomination. And I don't. I believe one speaker thought that maybe we were impinging on some grassroots Presbyterianism. That's always something we need to be self-aware of and think about that. But I disagreed with that thought. I think proper review and control is really important, and it makes sure that our whole denomination is moving in the right direction. So I'm encouraged by the seriousness of how that's working. The other part of this, and it gets back to that similar idea, but just in another expression, is I was really encouraged by a lot of the debate. It just there was good debate. I think I'm not. A lot of people have said this, that even from last year to this year, some of the issues that came back up this year were much better quality debate, speeches, better proposals, and I think I haven't been at General Assembly for all that long. My first one was in 2017. But it seems to me that some of the stuff that happened in the revoice controversies is we kind of took a longer view on how to do this. There were a lot of like, hey, let's fix this. But then when certain things got defeated, it wasn't the cause is lost. Let's leave. Let's do whatever. It was okay. Let's work. Let's talk with people with differing perspectives. Let's come back with a better proposal. I think you saw that this year with some of the other issues. And I'm just encouraged. I think that's healthy. There's always going to be disagreement. There's always going to be some new issue, but that's what you want to see. I think is taking seriously what we're doing, and taking a longer view of, even if you didn't get out of this General Assembly what you wanted, let's take a long view and work and maybe improve the proposals for next year, and maybe we do land upon something that, that last when we finalized the constitutionalization for the character and conduct of a teaching elder this year. I mean, no peep was uttered about that this year,
No
and
objection.
that was
Unanimous.
a long fight. That was a long debate in our denomination, and so I think that's evidence that there's a lot of thoughtful work that's going on between the General Assemblies and then during the actual week when the court is gathered.
Yeah. Steve, anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that was really encouraging to me was that there really wasn't any kind of hot button flash issue that was before the assembly, and yet it was still the third largest, right? So my fear was, once revoice was done, that all of a sudden, all of the men who were coming would stop coming, and we would be back to a 1,600 member assembly, which I don't believe was really representative of where the whole denomination was. I think what we've seen the last 4 years or so has been more representative of the PCA as a whole. And so that was encouraging, but that just has to continue. Men being willing to take a week and go, even if they don't think there's any major issue, because there were still important things that we discussed this year. They might not have been revoice level issues, and again, regardless of which side of that you landed on, you realized it was a major issue that needed to be dealt with, and so there's a lot of people who came out for that. So that's good. That needs to continue. I also find that the level of debate was good. I'm somewhat concerned about like Overture 1, or not Overture 1. Overture 1. Sorry, the one about with the Minority Report about witness eligibility. That's going to continue to come back, in one sense, maybe until it passes. And that's kind of said this when I was giving the report for the committee, that I feel like, a lot of the discussion was more on the, we want to do this and this is how we do it. And we were kind of missing the larger, is this something we actually should be doing question, which I'm not necessarily convinced one way or the other, but I want us to have that sort of philosophical question and really dig into why we do things the way we do currently before we make what is a pretty sweeping major change to our polity. And a lot of the arguments to me felt very pragmatic, even though they were less emotive than in previous years, and I appreciated that. They were still on a very pragmatic level, and pragmatism isn't necessarily a really good way to go or reason why we should make pretty big changes. So I know that kind of gets us past what you wanted to talk about, but I think that's something that I'm hoping this year there can be some more discussions about just kind of the philosophical areas.
Well, I'd love to have you on
but
but
overall,
I'd love to have you on another podcast to talk about those philosophical. So now you're obligated. Now you have to come back on.
Hey,
but thank you. In all seriousness, thank you both for coming on, and really appreciate your work and your insights both here and on the floor, and even from the dais.
Well, I've got to ride the wave of my new popularity as far as it'll take me. So,
thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it. Yeah.
This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Thanks to all of you who have subscribed, shared, and been guests on this podcast over the past year. Today we conclude Season 1. And Season 2 will begin, God willing, in August with more discussion and commentary on relevant topics in the PCA, as well as episodes that highlight the wondrous things the Lord is doing in the Presbyterian Church in America. If you are able to support the work of this podcast financially, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. We end Season 1 with reflections on this month's 51st General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America with some very special guests.